That's the only exit. What are you going to do next?
Wake up, Artyom, wake up!
Great, he's coming to.
Put the light away, you're blinding him.
Let's speak shortly about the malleability of racism before we finish this series. Let's talk about what the political left deem an example of a successful racial experiment. In the nation of Brazil, which has been diverse and even racially mixed, due to the lack of accompanying female black slaves and the lack of accompanying female European settlers, you still find racism and colorism in great quantity seriously affecting society every day. This despite that it has been diverse and racially mixed for many hundreds of years. As populations mix, new and more complex racial categories and labels gets developed. No group ever gets absolved. Blacks tend to live in the poor slums, while Asians and whites tend to live in gated communities or rural areas. Or how about Canada's oldest experiment in racial diversity?
Then there's Canada's oldest experiment in racial diversity. That is to say, relations between whites and Aboriginals. Now, this must be a very strong relationship indeed, because it goes back the farthest. And if diversity is strength, this would be mighty, mighty strong. Well, it was even used in America when Indians took over the town of Caledonia, Ontario, and chased out all the white people. Now, Maclean's magazine warns of more in an article of December 27th of 2006. They say, quote, Canada should brace for more dramatic displays of Aboriginal defiance in 2007, warn Native leaders, who say that the First Nations frustration that boiled over in a small Ontario town this year may well be the tipping point for decades of simmering Aboriginal anger. Simmering Aboriginal anger. Decades of it. I guess it must be another strength that somehow went wrong. On the very day of the Maclean's article, you know what the Mohawk Nation News says? I don't suspect you read that too often, but what they said was, quote, I'll quote again, don't get any ideas that we'll become Canadians. No way. We can and will handle our own affairs, so get out of our way while the going is good. Canada, you know, everything belongs to us, and we're getting it all back.
There's little need of me to point out more examples. The previous videos in this series have already shown more than enough. Regarding malleability, let's shortly see what Robert Putnam and Paul Bronson had to say about the contact theory.
And the result is you can go to quite diverse schools and not necessarily be learning to embrace people of every race.
School diversity is backfiring. I mean, you'd like to think that the more diverse a school, the more likely it is you'll have a friend of another race.
But the science says it's the other way around. The more diverse the school, the less likely it is that a child will have a friend of another race.
Contact theory was clearly given the no then, which also can be seen in the ethnic self-segregation section. What did Dateline, Gerard Taylor, Anthony Greenwald, and Masuren Benaji have to say about the social consequences of our relatively uncontrollable subconscious?
now describing something that would be even more difficult to change. You're saying people don't even have to have any kind of racial consciousness. They don't have to have any racial ill will. They just have to be just cruising along about race, blindly perpetuating racism. You're talking about a situation in which you are trying to change which individuals aren't even guilty. You want to blow up the institutions of the society despite the fact that the individuals in it have done no wrong. Hold on. That is an even greater Sisyphean impossible task than trying to change individual minds.
These aren't just words and faces on a screen, not just abstract images. This test suggests that when it comes to the potent question of race, our subconscious is making decisions every day. Decisions that in real time, in real life, have real consequences.
What did Howard Bloom say we should regard as a success and be happy and satisfied about regarding the level of malleability of racism?
It's very much a sponge racism. As a matter of fact, if you can't get rid of it among sponges, then you certainly can't get rid of it among human beings who are a good deal more complex. What you have to do is move the kind of racism. Move it from the kind of racism that we see in Zaire, where racism means killing 500,000 people with machetes, or in Kosovo, where it means driving out 1 million people, to the kind of racism we have in the United States, which seems to us to be an appalling thing, but in reality is not, because we compare it with those two racisms. We do not go after each other with machetes. We go after each other with words. If we can get racism, which is inevitable, down to the level of discourse, then we've accomplished an incredible thing.
He states that small levels of mutability ought to be considered enormous steps, implicitly stating something about the mutability of racism. Now, allow me to expose the faulty logic of the scientists who argue that it might be malleable by using logic and rationality based on the same data that they had access to. I'm arguing that the creators are drawing wrong conclusions regarding malleability from their studies. So let me first introduce you to in what sense they argue that it is malleable. The scientist's first argument is repeated exposure to eventually familiar faces and faces of admired celebrities of another race has shown to change attitudes temporarily.
With two academics who pride themselves on their enlightened attitudes, only to discover that they have latent within them biases they would fervently deny if their own test hadn't revealed them. But all may not be lost.
We found in research and also in testing of myself that if I put myself in a situation where I think about positive black exemplars, I think about Michael Jordan and Colin Powell and people like Martin Luther King who have had a very positive impact and who are also African American, I show much less bias immediately after thinking about those exemplars than if I hadn't thought about them.
Their second argument is that although a person's bad experience with a person of another race lingers on longer, it can be made to not persist as much by being exposed to more friendly people of that same race. These are seriously the oh-so-convincing arguments they found for the complete elimination of racism in normal, healthy human beings. Due to the politically correct cultural Marxist privilege, there is a bigger market to show that racism is malleable. If racial achievement gaps are due to alleged racism, and racism is malleable, then that calls for socialist interventions to achieve equality of outcome. The fact that they managed to produce so little evidence for the malleability of racism, despite the great incentive and politically correct privilege of there being a market to find such evidence, is telling that there really aren't much evidence pointing to mutability. Here's an indirect critique of the last argument, as well as some implicit counter-evidence to be remembered while I am explaining the lack of malleability of racism while refuting their so-called evidences for the malleability of racism. Let me first explain why these are not convincing arguments and evidences for the malleability of racism. To Susan T. Fiske, here's where I think she is missing something important from her conclusion in her study. For the average white person, other average whites are seen as other persons without having a first-hand experience or direct contact with them. However, for the average white person, other average blacks are not seen as merely other persons without having a first-hand experience or direct contact with them. In the case of blacks, for an example, they would have to first have been putting themselves through a normalization process, a process not necessary to put oneself through with whites or members of their own race. This is important. It is important because although white persons might get to personally know or create a few black acquaintances, the fact of the matter is that he can only do so to a limited set of individuals, and average blacks would still be seen as more than merely other persons. I will use an analogy, and the effect and truth value of this analogy depends on what type of breed of dog you have and what social abilities it has, but similarly, you can teach a particular breed of dog to get accustomed to a human family, but he will have to go through a normalization process he could have been without with his inherited tribe. However, this normalization process can only work for his particular human family of say 4 people, and their closest friends of a total of 10 to 15 people. The other humans are still seen as others, and so does other dogs, and here is where this analogy splits from the case with blacks and whites, and it becomes a false analogy. A dog is constantly living, and thus being exposed to a normalization process with a family in a way a white person is not doing with his black friends and acquaintances, which brings me to an analogy that is similar to the dog analogy: adoptions. It is a fact that adopted children of other races are more likely to get murdered by their parents that adopted them than are biological children by their biological parents. There is a clear divide here, and it does have to do with a sort of friction, a violation of the natural care one is supposed to have for one's biological children. And our minds, despite our normalization process, simply do not make us care similarly as much for our non-biological children and more genetically distant children. What this means is that a normalization process isn't as good as the quote-unquote real deal, close quote. The facts are that children have better and safer relationships with their biological parents than does adopted children, and this despite them both being exposed to the greatest normalization process thinkable. The other fact is that to the white person who just became friends with the black person, let's call him Tyrone, Tyrone is seen as but an exemption to all the other blacks. This while the white person never need this type of normalization process for the average white, regardless if they're friends or strangers. These are important facts left out from her conclusion. Perhaps this was too complex for you to comprehend, so let me simplify it a little bit. People of the same race as you are seen as average individuals. You don't think, oh, there goes a white person. This is not the case with people of another race, where what race the person is come beforehand what type of clothing they have. When they claim that we can, with repeated exposure to eventually familiar faces and faces of admired celebrities of other races, change our attitudes temporarily, it is specific to these people, and it is only temporary. With this said, it does in no way show that racism is valid. Okay, let's do a summary of what the video series has shown.